Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming here today virtually to listen to me read from The Mountain Whisperer by Pingwa, published a few months ago by Sino-West Press. I'm the translator, Christopher Payne. I'm here to read you a brief section from this novel that was written in 2014 in response more to the SARS epidemic that China endured in the earlier part of the 20th century, but it speaks volumes to what we are all experiencing today with continued lockdowns globally and a resurgence in the Delta variant. So I think it's a section that's quite apropos for what we are enduring today. So I'm going to jump right in and start reading. To quote, "I'm not sick. I haven't contracted the disease. Why are you stopping me from going home? Who's determined you're not sick? Where's your proof? You've come from an affected area. Who's to say you're not affected too? Why have you come? Huh? Why are you here? What are you here for? But I'm from here. Are you trying to tell me I can't go home? Tell me, which one of your families have I not made rich, and now you're treating me like this? You might have brought riches to us in the past, but now you're only bringing disease. You're not allowed in, at least not without going through some form of quarantine, so we know you're not sick. 10 days, yeah, you need to stay down in that cellar, just over there, for 10 days, so we can make sure there's nothing wrong with you. Why, you no good fuckers, I'm coming in!" Xisheng pushed at the young men barring his way, and in return their clubs fell hard, knocking him to the ground. Prostrate before them, he tilted his head and spat at the men standing around him, hitting one by the name of Heishuan. Enraged, Heishuan yelled out, "That dirty bastard is trying to make me sick." He turned and ran back inside to wash his face. Then he grabbed some dirt and rubbed it hard against his skin, trying desperately to wipe away any traces of Xisheng's saliva. "He's definitely sick," the rest of the crowd spoke in unison, looking down on Xisheng crumpled on the ground. "He's come here to spread the disease, to make us share in his fate." Lifting their clubs again, they began to pummel Xisheng without mercy. Taking stock of the escalating situation, Xisheng twisted his body and emerged briefly out of the crowd. He tried to flee, but the men gave chase and tackled him once again to the ground, seemingly intent on satisfying their rage. It didn't take long for word of this incident to reach Qiao Qiao, and she rushed over to help her husband. Frightened and with tears streaming down her face, she pulled and pleaded with the young men to stop. The village head also made an appearance, and Qiao Qiao implored him to do something as well. The village head, however, defended the actions of the crowd. "This is all in the best interests of Dangui. We've got to ensure the town is safe from infection." "But what's wrong with him? Look at him. Tell me, what's the problem? You know who he is, what he's done for the village. How can you say he's unsafe?" The village head remained quiet for a moment before shouting at the crowd to stop beating poor old Xisheng. The men refused, however, and Heishuan, who was at the front of the mob, could be heard yelling out with all his might that Xisheng had given him the disease, had in effect killed him, and so he was going to make sure Xisheng died first. Xisheng had little chance to fight back, so he tried to get away once more, running up on top of the embankments that encircled their fields. Heishuan pursued him, seemingly lost to an uncontrollable fury, but the farther up they scaled the embankment, the narrower it got too. Xisheng's pace was slow, and it would only be a moment or so before Heishuan's club was within reach of him. His only option was to spin around and bound back down the slope. Whether it was the speed at which he trundled down the hill or his age, unfortunately for Xisheng, he fell and fractured his leg. Qiao Qiao ran over to her husband, determined to pick him up and bring him home, but still they prevented her from returning inside the village limits with Xisheng, wounded or not. To resolve the situation, the village head called a meeting in which it was decided that Xisheng could enter the village, but he was barred from going anywhere else. In effect, he was to be quarantined at home. The decision made, Qiao Qiao returned to her husband, who had been forced to wait on the outskirts of the village, despite his broken leg. Carefully, she picked him up and hoisted him onto her back. As she strode along the familiar paths, Xisheng cursed the entire time. The villagers were all blind fools, idiots, small-minded, the lot of them. Qiao Qiao urged him to stop his rant, but her entreaty fell on deaf ears. Xisheng was now as enraged as the mob had been when they attacked him. Finally, Qiao Qiao resorted to threatening her husband, Go on, keep cursing them, and I'll let you down right here. I'm from Dangway as well, you know. It's your home too. So who are you cursing? Yourself?" He stopped bad-mouthing the village and turned to crying. "I'm not sick. I'm not." In truth, Shishang hadn't contracted the disease that was ravaging the country, but 3 days later the village head was bedridden and unable to get up. His temperature rose, and not long after he couldn't even be stirred awake. Most of the villagers suspected Shishang had brought the contagion with him, but neither he nor his wife showed any symptoms, and even Heishuan, who'd come in direct contact with Shishang's saliva, was also asymptomatic. Eventually, there was a grudging acceptance that Shishang hadn't brought the sickness to Dangwei, and so they began to wonder if the village head had not picked it up from someone else. Soon after, stories began to circulate. A week before, a number of villagers had apparently seen the village head's dog mating with some bitch from outside in one of the many glens that ran down the mountain. The bitch didn't belong to anyone in Dangwei, and so wanton conjecture led them to wonder if it was an infected stray that had passed the disease on, first to the village head's dog, and then on to its master. In response, patrols were stepped up, and the exclusion rules became even stricter. Not only were all outsiders prevented from entering the village, but any beast that actually roamed outside, whether it was a cow, a donkey, pig, dog, or chicken, would be beaten to death. The residents also attempted to confiscate the village head's dog, despite protestations from the man's wife, who tried to stop them by saying their pet had not been wandering, nor was it sick, for if it had contracted the illness, why hadn't it already perished? The beast, sensing the peril of the situation, scurried away from the clutches of the men and up onto part of the collapsed courtyard wall. It then leapt over to the lowest part of the roof and off and away from Dangwei. A day later, the village head died. His death hit Dangwei hard, partly because they feared how quickly he'd succumb to the illness, and how that may in turn presage the virus running rampant through the rest of the village. At the same time, they of course wanted to assist in the funeral preparations, the construction of a memorial, the coffin, and the burial. The body lay in state for 3 days, and they thought they ought to invite me to come and sing, but the only person who actually knew me was Shishang, and they had already done so poorly by him that they were too embarrassed to ask him to come and find me. And besides, they thought, I had been living in Huilongwan, and they feared sending anyone to come to the market town to find me, worried about the possibility of further contagion, to say nothing of having me come and potentially bringing the disease with me. As a result, no dirges were sung for the village head. The dead man's only accompaniment was his wife's crying, which lasted the same 3 days he lay in state. On the day of the burial, besides the young men who continued to patrol the village perimeter, everyone was at the funeral, with some serving as pallbearers. In other places, 4 pallbearers were involved in carrying the coffin, and others 8. For Dangwei and its dwarfish residents, however, different measures had to be put in place. First, a long vertical bar was tied across the length of the coffin, and then 6 more horizontal bars ran the width. Consequently, it took up to 16 men to carry the coffin. But in the case of the village head's funeral, there were only 4 to 5 men on each side, with 2 at the back and 2 in front. Thus the coffin tilted back and forward, swaying in a sort of deathly rhythm as the men stumbled and tripped their way to the burial site. By the halfway point, most of the men were drenched in sweat and required their wives to march along with them so as to wipe their brows. More than once, the women were heard to yell out about the amount of sweat draining down their husbands' faces. "Heavens, you're going to sweat yourselves dry. We're growing light-headed too." Once they reached the village head's final resting place and were able to put the coffin down, the pallbearers collapsed onto the ground, not daring to move any further, and hoping at the same time the wind would turn and provide them some respite. The sweat still poured down their faces, however, soaking their clothes, that they had begun to stick uncomfortably to their dwarf frames. They looked like they'd just stepped out of the water. "Tired?" one of the other villagers asked as he wiped a pallbearer's forehead and sat down next to him. "But why do I feel as tired as you?" The question went unanswered, but it hung in the air. Then, as agreed, the pallbearers were to be carried home, and the man who just sat down next to one of them reached his arms around the other man and strained to pick him up. Once positioned on his back, however, he couldn't help but call out, "You're running a fever! Shit! You're hot enough to burn me!" The pallbearers were taken home, and each one was nearly delirious by the time they got back. Soon after, their breathing grew laboured, and most fell unconscious. By the following morning, 3 of the men had died. The people panicked, certain that the village head had contracted the disease that had been plaguing the towns and cities, and now it had arrived here. To make matters worse, everyone had attended the funeral, and so now they all believed they were infected. The village was plunged into chaos, most cursing the heavens for what had supposedly befallen them. Xisheng and Jiao Chao had not stepped outside for what seemed like ages. It's not that they didn't want to. They'd thought about it, but they were prevented from doing so. The villagers had barred their gate, sealing them inside as part of their quarantine measures. That said, they could still hear the cries coming from the village, growing in volume daily. So many bad things have come back with me, haven't they? Xisheng grumbled to himself. Perhaps I did bring the affliction with me. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this piece. As I said at the beginning of my little intro, it is talking about the SARS epidemic that China experienced, but it sounds as though it could have been written in response to coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic that we are still enduring. So it does speak volumes to that, and the panic and fear that can grip people when an unknown virus is discovered, especially in these small rural communities. And it does speak to how often the panic and the emotional response can really bring about very violent actions, and oftentimes, cause more problems and more issues than are necessary. So it's a fantastic read. If you haven't yet purchased Jia Pingwa's novel, The Mountain Whisperer, I hope you do give it a go, because it is a fantastic read. And thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me today. Thank you. Bye-bye.